Hi, this is Ms. Hadi from Olympian High School. I want to introduce you to the Traditions and Encounters textbook for Chapter 9. We'll use the publisher-created PowerPoint slides and the book on the right to learn a little bit about state, society, and the quest for salvation in India. We'll start with this section on state, so looking at politics, looking at governance. First thing I want to remind you is, as you learned from the vignette, the classical Indian society is going to be very different from what you learned in Chapter 7 about classical Persia and what you learned in Chapter 8 about classical China, in that, unlike those two regions, we won't see the same lasting kind of centralized imperial state. We will see two attempts at centralized imperial state that seem like they might be able to sustain themselves and continue to create a precedent, but for the most part, we won't see the same level or degree of centralization. Although there will be two major empires that do last for some time that you'll need to know, the Mauryan and the Gupta. And in this video, I'm going to go over the Mauryan dynasty. So let's begin. So the first slide that you see through the publisher created PowerPoint is a slide that shows where the Mauryan Empire was located. And so here, this little triangle, this is called the subcontinent because Asia is so big as a continent. So they have the sub part, this is Asia. So you can recognize it by the triangle. And then Ceylon today is called Sri Lanka. You should know India is a large area. So when I say places like Gandhara, you need to know that that's northern India. Gujarat is also in the north. So just so you're aware or know some of these areas. I'll also mention Magadha, you see it here, and then Bactria. Bactria is what we now call like Pakistan, Afghanistan area, in case you're like wondering where is that? I've never seen that on a map. And then you can see that there's these trade routes that link South Asia with the rest of the other areas we've studied. So here would be the information from Chapter 7, and then over here it's going to be China from Chapter 8. So this is not in isolation. They're connected to other classical societies. So the first thing we want to do is look at what it was like before the arrival of centralized empire in India. So you should know that the Persians from Chapter 7, the Achaemenids, and I taught you a way to remember the major Persian empires. Remember Aunt Sally Parks Sassy, and that stands for Achaemenids, Seleucids, Parthians, and Sassanids, but I skip over Alexander the Great coming and attacking. So between the Achaemenids and the Seleucids, you have Alexander the Great attacking. So we need to remember what we learned from Chapter 7 because it's going to have an impact here. Okay, so if you remember from Chapter 7, the Achaemenids were ruling. You have the Persian Emperor Darius, who conquered northwest India. Because of this, Persian methods of administration, that just means how they governed, how they ruled, will be introduced into India. And that's important for you to know. I want you to understand that it was there was this diffusion of administrative techniques. However, as you know, the Achaemenids fall when Alexander of Macedon destroys the Persian Empire and conquers it. But then you also know what happens next, which is his troops mutiny. They don't want to go any further in India, and he ends up having to come back towards Persia, and then en route he dies, remember? That leaves what's called a political power vacuum. So if you remember from science class, a vacuum is a space where there's an absence of matter. And so why is that important? Because things rush in to fill that space. So if I cover something with a bowl and I lift the bowl, then all of these little things are going to rush into that space. And essentially, that's what was created when Alexander of Macedon left, is there's this desire for all these different groups to come in and fill that role of conquering and ruling that area. And the empire best suited to take over was a kingdom called the Kingdom of Magadha. So I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger so you guys could see. In the book, it just tells you that, they didn't even, a lot of records didn't even mention who Alexander the Great was, but the effect is he's going to create this power vacuum. So as I mentioned, the kingdom that's going to fill this power vacuum comes from the Ganges plain, sometimes pronounced the Ganges, sometimes Ganges. So the Ganges or the Ganges is also a river. So because of that river, the plain, the flat land where the river is going to be very fertile. And we know that the biggest part of an economy at that time is agriculture. So it's incredibly wealthy. It's a very strong economy. And they're going to make it even more wealthy when they clear the forests into fields. Basically, Magadha is also located in a central place, which makes it important for trade as well. So the person that I want you to remember who is going to take the kingdom of Magadha and transform it into a large empire is a man named Chandragupta Maurya, not to be confused with a later person I'm going to teach you about named Chandragupta, who's going to start a completely different empire called the Gupta Empire. So I know this can be confusing. You might want to make flashcards to remember the names. So Chandragupta Maurya is going to basically take over the Magadha Empire and then conquer the states nearby to create a centralized state. So in this paragraph, it's going to tell you about how he gradually took over different states and then consolidated his hold. He strengthened his control over the Punjab and then took over a state called in Bactria that was a Greek state. You might be wondering, why are Greek people there? Why are they in Persia? Bactria in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Well, that's because they were successors to Alexander of Macedon's people. They had created this kingdom, which Chandragupta then absorbed into his realm. So again, the kingdom of Magadha is located in the central Ganges plain. It's economically very strong. It starts to dominate the surrounding regions, and that's what the slide on the left is teaching you. Chandragupta takes advantage of the power vacuum. He overthrows the Magadha rulers, and he creates the first unified Indian empire, all except the very tip of the subcontinent. The part of the very south is going to be part of the Mauryan dynasty, named after Chandragupta Maurya. The way that Chandragupta governs or administers his realm is largely through the advice of an advisor named Kautilya, when his ideas are recorded in a book called the Arthashastra, which gave all these instructions for how someone should govern a state with really interesting methods. So some of the methods make sense. They're kind of basic, like oversee trade and agriculture, collect taxes, conduct foreign relations. But some of them are also really interesting, like making abundant use of spies, which is very similar to the Persians and their eyes and ears of the king. So I want you to make this comparison in your brain when you're reading to other chapters that you've learned. So here it's just telling you about the Arthashastra. It's in italics because it's a book. These are some of the topics that it covered: foreign policies, economics, and domestic policies. Domestic means within the state. So again, advocating for a large corps of spies, including women, prostitutes, because they would be less suspected. According to tradition, according to legend, Chandragupta Maurya will eventually abdicate his throne. He's going to give up his throne, all of his riches, all of his wealth, to go and seek spiritual salvation, to become a monk. And supposedly, he was so devout and so committed that he starved himself to death through his ascetic practices. We don't really know if that story is true or not, but it's an interesting one. His son will then succeed him, but the really important ruler for the Mauryan Empire that we need to learn about is a man named Ashoka. Sometimes you'll see it spelled Ashoka, and sometimes with just Asoka. When I was a student at Berkeley, my two roommates in my sophomore year were both Indian, and I remember they took me to go watch a Bollywood film. It was my first Bollywood film in the theater. Bollywood is like the Hollywood of India, and there's always singing and dancing in the movies. But because Indian culture is conservative, they'll get really close, but they'll never kiss. It's a really interesting genre of films that you can watch. So if you get a chance to watch it for extra credit, it's the Ashoka spelled with just a Asoka. And there's a really handsome Indian actor in there, Shah Rukh Khan. There's also some very beautiful Indian actresses that you can see, and this will bring it home for you. The story of Ashoka. And it's not really completely true to history. They make it more of a romantic love story, but inside the movie, there's a reference to this battle you're going to read about in your chapter, the battle over Kaling or Kalinga or Orissa, depending on how you describe it. This was one of the only kingdoms that was still independent of the Mauryan kingdom when Ashoka came to power, and he's going to subdue it, but with lots of violence. as many as 100,000 to 200,000 Kalingians or Orisans perished in this conflict. And some people say that that's why Ashoka would later convert to Buddhism, because the violence caused him to be introspective and seek spiritual salvation, and that this drew him to become a Buddhist ruler. Okay, so if you watch the movie, you'll see the battle. So again, he's the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya. He's ruling at the peak, at the height of the Mauryan dynasty. You need to know about the battle over Kalinga and how violent it was. Even though he is good at conquering lands, he's also a very good governor. So he's going to rule over that tightly organized bureaucracy. He will have a capital city at Pataliputra, which will show up potentially on your test, and it's not in the PowerPoint, so make sure you know about Pataliputra. It was a cosmopolitan city, meaning that there are people from all parts of the world living here, at least all parts of the known world at that time. He continued to collect taxes and support a large bureaucracy, including officials, accountants, clerks. And he also is famous for erecting these rock and pillar edicts. So I would put that on an inspect chart if you're making one to study. There's an example where he talks about wanting to be a good Buddhist ruler, wanting to be a humane, just ruler. Now we want to think about what are the effects of Ashoka's policies. One of the effects of his policies is that the economy will improve because of things that he did to encourage the expansion of agriculture, including building irrigation systems and building roads, which will support trade, especially a road from Pataliputra to Taxila. And you'll read in your book about how these were really nice roads, but with shade from banyan trees and whatnot. After Ashoka died, however, his empire starts to decline, largely because of acute or severe financial problems that have to do with the large military and bureaucracy that they had to support. And so within 50 years of Ashoka's death, we start to see problems, financial problems, these administrative costs that have to be dealt with. And the way that the Mauryan emperors dealt with it was not wise. One of the things they did was try to debase their currency. So back then, people traded using coins, and the coins were made of metal, like say gold or silver. And so what they did was they pretended that the coin still had the same amount of metal as it did before, but in reality, they had debased it. There was less metal in it. So people knew that. They figured it out. They're not dumb. And so they're like, well, nominally on the surface, if you know the word nombre by name, this says, let's pretend it's 50 cents. They didn't use 50 cents, but pretend. But actually, there's only 39 cents worth of metal in here. And so that's going to cause people to lose confidence in the economy. And by the year 185, the Mauryan Empire is going to have lots of problems and fall. Here on the PowerPoint, you can see that one of the effects of Ashoka's leadership before he died was that he integrated or connected a large part of his empire. And then you'll also see in the PowerPoint what happens after his death, the economic crisis due to the bureaucracy and military, the devaluation of the currency, and then the fall of the Mauryan Empire. I'll pick up with the regional kingdoms in the next video.